of the U.S. and Canada. During this meeting, there will be no discussion allowed concerning prices, customers, customer or market allocations, specific accounts, discounts, terms, and all other matters prohibited by law. If it were to happen, we would have to end the call immediately. And I'm going to turn this right on over to Mike.
Thank you, Taryn. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you once again. As Taryn mentioned, maybe before a few of you came on, we believe this is our 10th call. They do have a certain Groundhog Day aspect to them, but we do have a treat today, and we'll get to our featured speaker, Scott Clemons, in a moment. Just want to remind folks that are on the video conference that it is renewal season for AICC. We'd certainly like you to renew your membership. We work on a fiscal year that begins on July 1st. You have received a renewal notice from us. You've probably received a reminder by now from us. Plus, you'll see a lot of links in AICC mails and events, event information that also has renewal information with it. And if you have any questions about renewals, by all means, speak with any AICC staffer. A lot of folks that are renewing are sharing a lot of very kind words with us, and with that in mind, and in the spirit of renewal season, we wanted to just start off with some remarks from Lauren Frisch, who's responsible or in sales at Wasatch Container, who's going to share with us some impressions of what AICC does for Wasatch Container. Lauren.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
All right. So I just wanted to share just what Mike said about how specifically these COVID weekly calls, how they've affected myself and Wasatch Container. So the AICC, the COVID weekly calls gave myself and Wasatch Container a sense of a box maker community through this crisis. And as a millennial, this is my first pandemic and a scare of a recession in my career, which is very scary and uneasy. And having the AICC weekly calls is an incredible resource through this uneasy time as a young leader. So just when, we all felt exhausted, but lucky that we made it through another week with following CDC guidelines, with dealing with scared employees not coming in, positive cases, or whatever your business conditions were changing, we would jump on the Friday afternoon meeting, and it made myself and the Wasatch Container team feel like we weren't alone. And not only we weren't alone, it was really the exact opposite, that we as box makers were all coming together and helping each other and giving invaluable advice. And which is pretty incredible, because some of us are competitors with each other. We're in the same accounts, but yet still sharing best practices and time-sensitive information. And we're all very busy individuals and trying to keep our businesses running through this, but yet members found time to help fellow AICC members. And that's really what this is all about. And so another thing that I loved about those calls is the variety of box makers that contributed to the calls. We had big to small companies. We had West Coast to East Coast, companies that were hit hard by COVID, and others that not so much. So it was really nice to get a huge variety of company and practices and advice of what was going on. For myself, the first COVID call was the most impactful for us at Wasatch Container, because we only knew what we knew at the time. We're in Utah, we're pretty sheltered in the sense that states were getting hard and other box makers were so many steps ahead of us. While we were just trying to figure out how to find toilet paper, other people were way ahead of us. So the COVID calls definitely educated us tremendously on what other box makers were doing, so we could prepare for the waters that were very closely ahead of us. So I definitely wanted to give a shout out to those people who really stepped up during these calls. I think we all can agree that Mitch Klinger was a huge asset with keeping us all informed and up to date regarding the Payment Protection Program information. The government was and still continues to change the PPP rules, and we knew we could always count on Mitch to give us the most updated and accurate information. He kept us informed on what was forgivable, how much could go towards certain categories, how to track it, and so that was very helpful. A couple others was Gene Marino with Ruskin Packaging, Greg Tucker with Bay Cities, Joe Palmieri with Jamestown Container, and many more. But, you know, those individuals specifically were always so prepared and willing to share their best practices and answer tough questions, and which really helped us a lot. And it's not like they knew everything they were doing either, but at least they were willing to be vulnerable and honest and tell us what was going on in their plants, even if it wasn't an ideal situation. So that's been my experience with the AICC COVID calls, nothing but positive things. So I really want to thank, probably on behalf of all AICC members, thank the AICC staff for being on top of it and making these calls a reality, because this is exactly what us box makers need. And we needed a sense of a box maker community. So it really proves that AICC is going to be there for us through the good and the bad times. So thank you again for all your efforts. And Mike, I'll send it back to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Appreciate that. And for those of you that are on the call that are non-members, because this is open to the industry because of the type of information we've been sharing, we think, as we mentioned before, all boats rise on the tide. After the content of this video conference is complete, anyone that wants to stay on, I'll do a quick review of AICC member benefits for anyone that's interested. But without further ado, we'll go to the main event here. We have joining us, who is no stranger to AICC, Scott Clemons from Brown Brothers Harriman, is going to speak with us about the macroeconomic view of the COVID crisis and give us some thoughts, tips. I've seen his presentation, some great charts. And as I said, he's no stranger to AICC. He spoke at AICC's fall meeting in Fort Worth in 2015, 2 very good reviews, I might add. And I would like to thank Matt Davis of Packaging Express and his brother Tom, who is also at Brown Brothers Harriman, for putting this together so that Scott can join us. Scott, please.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And thank you all for taking time today. A rumor spreading through Wall Street this morning is that today is Friday. Pending verification of that rumor, happy Friday. I'm going to share my screen with you. I think Mike or Taryn have this. If you'd like a copy of these slides, they can get them to you, or I'd be happy to send them to you myself. That's my contact information on the bottom, and I will show you that again as we get to the end. What I would propose to do is to go through this pretty quickly, maybe 20 minutes or so. It's a high top-down view of what's going on in the economy, where we stand in the COVID-19 crisis, the impact on the economy, what it's going to take to get to the other side of the economic crisis, implications for some financial markets as well. That's important whether you're an investor or a borrower. The impact on interest rates is important. And then I'll end by looking at some of the other risks out there worth keeping an eye on, some of which actually have nothing to do with COVID-19. Obviously, that's dominated headlines for all the right reasons for the past 2 or 3 months, but there are other things going on that warrant some attention as well. I won't linger too long on the healthcare part of the crisis because you're inundated with this kind of information. But it's worth remembering, whether you're someone like me who's an economist or someone running a business, that the economic crisis with which we're dealing is in its catalyst a healthcare crisis. And that's different. I grew up knowing that economic cycles happen for 1 of 2 reasons. Either the Federal Reserve tightens monetary policy and raises interest rates too much, and that chokes off business, or more recently, excesses on Wall Street bubble up and finally pop, be it the dot-com bubble or the mortgage bubble about 12 years ago. This one is different. The Federal Reserve was not raising interest rates headed into this, and there were no excesses on Wall Street that popped. This is a third category of catalyst for economic cycles, into which I guess you would put alien invasions and asteroids and, an alien invasion that's so small you can't even see it. So this time is genuinely different. There's good news, and the good news, which you all know about, is that because of the steps that have been taken, the incidences of COVID-19 are beginning to wane, even in those areas where they were quite intense 4 weeks or 6 weeks ago. I look at this in a wide variety of ways. This is just the biggest picture, sort of nationwide level. The 2 important trends, of course, are the cumulative case count. That's the red line on a log scale to illustrate the rate of change. success here ultimately looks like that red line going all the way flat. Flat to the red line means there are no new daily cases taking place. The blue bars are daily cases, and of course it's headed in the right direction. Not in a straight line, nothing ever heads in a straight line, some undulation, but as you look at this nationwide, the peak in cases was early April. That's close to 2 months ago. So I think we're past the worst of it. Tempering that somewhat is the observation that because so much of the epicenter of this was in the New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut area, where I'm from, that it's really success in those areas that are bringing down the overall numbers. So if you look at this now on page 3, same data set, all I've done is subtract out the tri-state area in northeastern United States. Numbers are still coming down, but it's not altogether clear that we're out of the woods quite yet. Of course, as you all know well, reopening the economy is not a single binary event. It's got to take place region by region, state by state, city by city, and maybe even block by block in some urban areas. So I pay very close attention on a state and even a city level to where these trends are falling out. This is just a selection of the kind of data that I look at. I'd be happy to send this data to you if you'd like it for another state. But it's pretty simple. Total cases, it's total cases per population that's really important, because obviously some states are more crowded than others. And the daily growth rate. I also translate that into a days to double column, sort of right in the middle of this page, because it is easy to become complacent only looking at a daily growth rate. Because you look at a number, take North Carolina, sort of 2/3 of the way down the screen, and you think, well, 2.3% sounds like a pretty low growth rate, and you know it is, but when you do the math, that means North Carolina at this pace is doubling their case count every month. So not entirely clear that they've quite got a handle on it. I look at the date of peak cases and then how many days it's been since then. That's some indication that progress is taking place. Of course, increasingly, the challenging thing in following this data is it's really measuring two variables, not one. It's measuring not only truly new diagnoses of COVID-19, but it also captures wider testing. I think particularly if you look at California, where there seems to be a surge coming in, I think what's really happening in California is just a rollout of much, much broader testing. So they're capturing cases that were kind of there all along. It makes it difficult to follow. But as you are aware, different states and different regions are opening at different paces. This is a data that I've grabbed just from the website of the New York Times, who have very good data scientists who are reporting on these things. The color scheme is pretty straightforward. The darker blue states are already in the process of reopening. The mustard colored lined states are reopening region by region. And then the pure yellow states, of which is only one left, New Jersey, are completely shut down. So we are beginning to reopen, and so far, so good. Every state is different, but fears about a second surge of COVID-19 on reopening seem so far to have been unfounded. Particularly some of these states in the Southeast, like Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, that began reopening in late April. So now 4 weeks ago, have done so without big second surges in COVID-19. That may be due to the climate, that may be due to changing temperatures. It may just be due to the fact that we're aware of it. People are actually observing social distancing, but so far so good. And that's actually quite a beneficial indication for future economic activity. Now, the bad news, of course, is that the economic toll is already in place, and we're seeing it. A lot of it's lag data, and a lot of it is all backward looking, but we're beginning to see the real objective impact of this. What you're seeing here is manufacturing sentiment survey. These are the ISM, the Institute for Supply Management surveys. The blue line is the one that you normally see quoted, the Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index. The red line is the similar index, but specifically related to export sentiment. And that line in particular is back down to where it was in the worst days of the global financial crisis. These are just April data, so this does not yet capture May. And we're going to look at some May data that argues that maybe we've turned the corner and maybe the worst is behind us. We're certainly seeing a big hit in the labor market. I know every single person on this call is wrestling with this. Once again, this is April data. We will get May employment data 1 week from today. Lost 20.5 million jobs in April. I've circled the global financial crisis there for two reasons. One, to illustrate that we've lost almost 3 times as many jobs in 1 month as we did in the entirety of the global financial crisis. And I've also circled it because if I didn't, it might be hard to see on this chart. As big and as catastrophic as the global financial crisis was, now it's almost hard to see in the record of the unemployment numbers. Unemployment rate itself in April jumped to almost 15%, and this will almost certainly head higher once we get the May data. And what to me is most remarkable about this chart is certainly the absolute level is remarkable. It's the highest unemployment rate on record. What's even more remarkable is that the February 2020 unemployment rate, so just 2 months ago, was 3.5%, and that was the lowest unemployment rate on record. So we have gone from one record to another record in the space of 8 weeks. And that just illustrates the rapid onset of this crisis, how quickly it fed through into the labor markets. Now, you may accuse me of being a little bit of a glass half full kind of guy, but I actually think there are some silver linings in this data, and some silver linings that lead me to conclude that indeed the worst may be behind us, not that the path to recovery is as quick as the path down was, but that we are at least poised to head in the right direction. As part of the labor market report that comes out each month, the people who do the survey ask if you have lost a job, if you believe your job loss to be permanent or temporary. And as you can see from this chart, 10, 15, maybe 20% of the time, historically, people have said that they believe their lost job is temporary. A labor action or a fire at the factory or something where people say, you know, I'm not working, but my job is still there. I'm just not back there quite yet. In April, 78% of people reported that they believe their job loss to be temporary. Now, of course, this doesn't mean they're right. There's no guarantee behind that, but it does speak to at least the expectation that what we're seeing is not a true destruction of jobs and economic activity as much as it is just a pause. And of course, a lot of the CARES Act, in particular the Paycheck Protection Program, was designed to bridge whatever that hiatus may be. And again, as I know everybody on this call is well aware, Congress, or rather the House, just yesterday passed the Payroll Protection Program Flexibility Act. It's a mouthful, that would extend the terms of that program so that employers would have 24 weeks to use the proceeds instead of just 8, and would only need to use 60% of the proceeds on payroll as opposed to 75% in order to turn that into a grant or forgive the loan. So these are bridge loans or life preservers to make sure that that 78% number on this page actually is as close as possible to reality. Another labor market silver lining comes in the form of the weekly claims for initial unemployment. And here too, you can see the rapidity of the onset of the economic catastrophe. This was running at a nationwide basis about a little over 200,000 new claims a week, people newly laid off. By the third week of March, 6.9 million claims in a week. That's the bad news. But since then, there's been a step function down. Now, the numbers are still horrible. The absolute level of these numbers are still horrible, but they're bad at a decreasing rate. And again, you can accuse me of having rose-colored glasses, but in economics, trends at the margin are what really make a difference. And at the margin, these numbers are beginning to improve. And this may be why we haven't seen a bigger drop in consumer confidence. Of all of the economic data series that I look at, this is probably the one that has surprised me the most. If you had told me at the beginning of this year, with a perfect crystal ball, guess what? There's going to be this global pandemic that's going to kill over 100,000 Americans and counting. We're going to respond to it by shutting the economy down. But you know what? Consumer confidence is going to be okay. There's no way that that could possibly be true. And yet it is. Whether you look at the current sentiment, those the blue line here, or people's expectations about the future, that's the red line, there's no question they've come down. There's no question that confidence has been dented. But confidence levels aren't down to where they were during the global financial crisis. I read into this some expectation that this is indeed a temporary economic impairment from which we will recover. Again, not all the way back to pre-crisis levels, and not right away. It's not going to be that simple. There's enough dislocation to where it will take some time to get all the way out of this hole. But what we're seeing is probably not a genuine destruction of demand, the likes of which the economic numbers a month ago might have indicated. And it's possible we're beginning to see this in some manufacturing survey data as well. I show you here, this is the New York Federal Reserve Survey, the Empire State Survey. I'm not doing this to pick on New York, it's just the New York Fed is one of the earliest Feds to report their regional survey. This data is now of May. A lot of the economic data that we're dealing with is dated back to April. And in May, the surveys were still down, but they were not down as much as they were in the previous month. And again, you can readily accuse me of grasping at straws here, but the directionality of this trend is improving. The only other Fed to have, regional Fed to have so far reported a May survey is Philadelphia. And there too, we're seeing the same kind of trends. The surveys are still below 50, and readings below 50 on this indicate an ongoing contraction. Sorry, readings below 0 on this scale, but the readings are better than they were in April. What's important as well, and this is an important distinction to keep in mind, even when governors and mayors and authorities begin to reopen states, what's really important is that people respond to that. If a governor in a state says everything is fine, wear your mask and you're fine, go back out to the stores, go back out to the restaurants, engage in economic activity, if nobody does it, it doesn't have a real impact on economic activity. So I am very interested in looking at near-term, high-frequency economic data where I can find it. And there's not a lot of it out there. This, though, has been one of my go-to measures to watch. You're probably all familiar with the online restaurant reservation site Open Table, or an app on your phone. You can see in the Open Table data the year-over-year change in reservation activity, city by city. And so we watched this over the course of early March as every city in the United States, every city in the world for that matter, restaurant reservations fell to negative 100%. For the most part, because restaurants were closed. You couldn't make a reservation if you want to. But if you look over the course of May, in some parts of the country, not only are economies reopening, but people are responding to it. I don't want to overstate this. The numbers are still way down year over year, but they're rising, they're getting better. And again, particularly in the Southeast, Tampa, Florida is the best. Tampa, Florida restaurant reservations down only 30% year over year, but you can see a handful of cities in Texas, Atlanta, Georgia. There is some evidence that some economic activity is beginning to return. My other high frequency data is air travel. You can track on a daily basis how many people go through a TSA screening checkpoint. It's usually 1.5 million, 2 million a day. In early March, the earliest bit of this data here would have captured me. I was still traveling like a madman all the way through the second week of March. And you can see how those numbers fell precipitously down to below 100,000. It's sort of hard to believe there were still 100,000 people traveling in late March and early April, but that's way down from 1.5 to 2 million. These numbers too, beginning a slow and steady uptrend as well. So these are encouraging signs, and I think the slowness of the recovery speaks to the difficulty of getting back to full economic output. I do think that there's enough pent-up demand from people being cooped up at home or wherever they're sheltering that the early days of the recovery may look like what economists are fond of calling the V-shaped recovery. There's a snapback of demand. But I want to caution you, that's not likely a snapback all the way to pre-crisis levels of economic activity. There's enough dislocation, enough retail and restaurants and small operations will not open. There is some job destruction that's taken place, obviously. I think we get a sharp rebound back up to sort of call it 85% of pre-crisis economic output, followed by probably a couple of years of slow recovery to get all the way back to where we started the year in terms of a pace of economic activity. Keep an eye on Washington. I do think that Washington is going to come out with another more traditional stimulus package between now and the end of the year. The CARES Act was not really a stimulus package. It was really sort of a bridge loan. I think you will see a more traditional stimulus package. We're at the stage right now in which politicians are jockeying to get their favorite pet project into the conversation. That's the way, laws get made. So a lot of ideas are being thrown out to see if they can get some traction. I do think the program, when it's finally passed and winds its way through the halls of Congress and makes it to the president's desk might include things like a payroll tax holiday, or a cut in payroll taxes, may include something like a restoration of the deductibility of state and local taxes, which of course were taken out or taken away in the Trump tax bill of 2018. And there's sort of hope springs eternal that there may be an infrastructure package or an infrastructure program built into this as well. That's obviously an investment in future productivity of the United States of America. It would be a jobs program as well, and that's a pretty tempting thing for Congress people on both sides of the aisle. So keep an eye on that, probably over the course of the summer, maybe into the fall. Financial markets have responded very rapidly to this, and this is a conundrum. It's probably the question that I get asked by my clients, our clients at Brown Brothers most frequently. How can the market be doing as well as it is when the news headlines, albeit better, are still pretty awful? This is the S&P 500. Large capitalization public companies were down 34% in 23 days. That is an unprecedentedly steep drop in the market, but followed by an unprecedentedly steep rebound, up 35% now in the past 45 days. Of course, 34% down and 35% up doesn't get you back to where you started. Obviously, that's the way the math works. But nonetheless, the market's now only down 11 or 12% from the beginning of the year, and is actually up year over year. Is there a disconnect here? Is this just Wall Street and Main Street completely divorced from each other, or Wall Street investors losing their minds? The answer is they might be, but not for this reason. This is a reflection of what markets always do. Markets anticipate. The price of an individual security, the price of the overall market, is not determined by today's headlines. It's really determined by what investors think the headlines or the investment environment will be 12 months or 18 months down the road. Now, of course, nobody knows what they're going to be that far down the road, which is why the directionality matters. And if you think about the evening news 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks ago, we were worried about running out of hospital beds, running out of ventilators. They were building a hospital in Central Park in New York City. Well, today we're not talking about that. Today we're talking about vaccine trials. We're talking about states reopening. The tenor of the conversation is a lot better, and markets are moving in advance of that, as they always do. And the classic example was going back to the last financial crisis, the last economic cycle in 2008, 2009, and into 2010. The red line here again is the S&P 500 index. In that cycle, it bottomed on March the 9th of 2009. Things were still awful. As a matter of fact, the recession didn't end until later that summer, by which point the market was already up 37%. The labor market continued getting worse. Unemployment rose all the way through Thanksgiving of 2009. Only then did it begin to turn for the better, by which point the market was up 63%. A year down the road, only then did it become obvious or even more likely that, maybe we're out of the woods. Maybe the worst of this is actually behind us. At which point the headlines began to reflect improving sentiment, but the market was already up 71%. So markets anticipate. That's just what they do. What's helped here is what the Federal Reserve has done as well. In late March, the Federal Reserve, our central bank, began to put into place a wide variety of mechanisms to prevent the healthcare and the economic crisis from becoming a financial crisis and a banking crisis. And I have to give them high marks, at least so far, for succeeding in that. There are a wide variety of programs, the biggest of which, or the biggest bazooka, is simply the way they use their balance sheet. So the Fed's balance sheet, assets on the Fed's balance sheet, just last week topped $7 trillion with a T, and that's up from about $4 trillion in mid-February. That's an additional $3 trillion of assets. And here's what that means. That looks like reserves on commercial banks' balance sheets. So Bank of America, Wells Fargo, HSBC, US Bank, that's reserves for them. Banks can regulatorily or theoretically lend up to 10 times their level of reserves. Now, they never do. Nobody manages a bank that close to the regulatory edge. But theoretically, this additional $2.9 trillion of reserves could turn into $29 trillion of lending or balance sheet strength. This is the Fed's way of saying, I want to make sure that commercial banks are strong enough that if loans are delayed, if mortgages aren't repaid, if firms come to the bank and say, give me a few more months to pay off that loan, that the banks have the financial strength to say, yes, we'll let you do that. And again, so far, so good. This $2.9 trillion has to go somewhere, and one of the places it goes is into financial markets. So in addition to there being this improving trend in the fundamental news flow, at least at the margin, you've also got this added support from the Federal Reserve, which looks like the monetary equivalent of shock and awe. One of the other things that the Fed has done is to lower interest rates. And that's best exemplified here. I've just taken a snapshot. These are Treasury yield curves. So this is the yield on U.S. Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. From the very left-hand side of the graph is a 1-month maturity all the way out to 30 years on the right side of the graph. At the beginning of the year, the green line was the yield curve. Interest rates ranged from 1.5% to about 2.5%. And since then, they've fallen by about a full 100 basis points, if not even more. I included the red line, the late March line, just to illustrate how fractured even big markets like Treasury markets were. If you look at the very left-hand side of that red line, you'll see that it dipped below zero. In other words, interest rates on 1-month, 2-month, 3-month, all the way up to 6-month Treasury bills had a negative sign in front of them. That's not uncommon in parts of Europe, and it's certainly not uncommon in Japan. It's very rare in the United States of America. And as a sign of how panicked investors were, they were willing to lend money to the US government, that is, buy a government bond for 3 months or 6 months for a guaranteed loss. But they did so because they were guaranteed the return of their money. The return on their money became irrelevant. That's a pretty remarkable state of affairs. It's corrected. I mean, interest rates are not high now, but as you can see, the blue line, which is a couple of days ago, I guess that was yesterday I updated this chart, still pretty low, but not negative. But likely to stay that low for some time to come. This graph now, the blue line here is the Federal Reserve Fed funds rate. This is the policy rate. It's essentially the rate at which banks lend to each other. That's important because that determines the rate at which banks can lend to you and me. And that's the rate the Fed cut to zero in the second week of March. And as you can see, the futures market is anticipating that that rate will be zero for several years to come. And this is the Fed's way of saying we're going to buy an insurance policy and make extra sure, triply sure, quadruply sure that the economic recovery takes place in such a smooth way that it's not discombobulated by rising interest rates. And I think that's likely to be the path that unfolds. This is good news if you're borrowing money. I mean, interest rates are very low. You probably can't borrow money at zero, but interest rates are very low. They're likely to remain that way for some time to come. Makes it difficult for people like Tom Davis and I, who advise investors on where to put money to work, because whereas it's nice to borrow money at very low interest rates, to invest it at very low interest rates is an altogether different matter. It makes it hard to be an investor in bonds or in fixed income in particular. As a strategist and as an investor, I'm always looking to the future and sort of what changes may be coming down the road. There's a lot of talk about the lasting impacts of COVID-19. There's an old adage in financial markets that when you get a dislocation like this, or the dot-com bubble, or the mortgage crisis, or any sort of shock, there's an old adage that the short-run implications are almost always overstated, but the long-run implications are almost always understated. So the statement that, well, no one's ever going to go out to a theater again, no one's ever going to go out to eat again. We're a social species. We delight in the company of other people. We're going out to eat again, and we're going to go bowling again, and we're going to go to theaters again, and we're going to have birthday parties again, and those things are going to happen. I'm very interested in the longer term implications, and this is a work in progress, of course, because we're still in some ways kind of in the middle of the economic part of this crisis. I do think you'll see at the household level, households will save more. They will take on less debt. That is not a new trend. That's been underway for 10 or 15 years now. COVID will likely accelerate it. I think you'll likely see people consume more at home, even when they can go out again. They may find that family movie night is a permanent part of the rotation now. They may consume more meals at home now that they realize they can actually use their kitchen to cook things. I think you'll also see an accelerated deurbanization. Obviously, the hotspots of this health crisis were in those areas in which social distancing was simply impossible, like my hometown of New York City. I'm sitting about 100 miles north of New York right now, as I have been for several months now. But that deurbanization, too, is not a new trend. Population in major urban areas peaked in most cases in 2017 or 2018. Implications for the workplace are massive. We're already seeing among our clients who own and operate businesses a realignment of supply chains to rely less on foreign suppliers. I think in particular, one of our clients who owns a manufacturing facility in the greater Philadelphia area was reliant on a single Chinese supplier of a critical input element into their manufacturing process. And their single supplier happened to have been in Hubei province, which was where the Chinese outbreak of COVID first took place. They had to shut their manufacturing operations down the second week of January, long before COVID was a real problem here, because of their reliance on that sole supplier. They're moving that supply chain back closer to home, and I think a lot of companies are thinking of doing similar things. Companies who are all right now working remotely will find to some degree that may become business as usual for at least part of their labor force. That has implications for commercial real estate, again, predominantly in large areas. And I think obviously greater use of technology, such as we are doing right now, will likely lead to less travel. I probably travel to visit clients or to go to conventions. I probably, in a normal year at least, travel 150,000 miles a year. I probably won't do that ever again. I'll probably still travel 100,000 miles, but at the margin, that one trip from New York to the West Coast to have one 90-minute meeting with a client will probably turn into a Zoom call, probably at the client's request for that matter. And if you think about the ripple effects of that, that's one less airfare, that's one less night in a hotel, that's bad for the airline and hotel industry. It's good for my firm's bottom line, that's less spending, it's less wear and tear on my own physical person, it's less pollution for the environment, less carbon emission. So there are positive effects, there are negative effects, and as we see this greater use of technology play out, it'll be interesting to see how that may benefit the bottom line of a lot of companies. School and higher education, I think, is increasingly going to be the ground zero of the response to COVID-19. If you think about it from an epidemiological standpoint, a college campus looks just like a cruise ship. You have a lot of different people from a lot of different parts of the country, if not the world, coming together in very close proximity for a period of time and then going away again. This is a recipe for spreading contagion. So schools, fortunately have the summer to figure out how do we introduce more remote learning? How do we reduce the physical presence on campus? How can we maintain social distancing? This is hard, if not impossible, for college students. I think you're going to see a lot more students take gap years, maybe take a year off, do an internship, work, study abroad if they can get abroad, do a mission trip. Something so that colleges have a chance to get back to normal, whatever normal means. It's a big challenge for the finances of colleges, particularly those who don't have big endowments and those who are reliant on a lot of foreign students paying full fare. I think you will see over the course of the summer a lot of second and third tier private colleges just won't reopen their doors ever again. They'll declare bankruptcy. That too is not a new trend. We've seen that taking place. COVID is likely just an accelerant of that. So a couple of conclusions, a couple of risks, and then we'll open it up for conversation. We're not at the end of this crisis. We may be at the end of the beginning. If states and regions can reopen safely, which so far so good, then I think there's another side to this. There's light at the end of the tunnel as we head into the fall. The bad news is the economic damage is sort of done. The good news, in an ironic way, is that everybody knows that. So the bad news is not necessarily new news, and that in a weird way kind of makes it good news. Everyone knows that all the economic data is backward looking, and the future does not look like the past, given the severity and the rapidity of the downturn. We will get more support from government entities. I do think there will be another stimulus package from Washington, and I do believe the Federal Reserve stands ready, willing, and able to step in if they need to. Jay Powell was just on a webinar this morning hosted by Alan Blinder ironically, Princeton University, my alma mater, reunions were supposed to be this weekend. They're obviously not happening. Jay Powell, who graduated from Princeton in 1975, agreed to do a webinar for alumni and basically said, yeah, the Fed's job is not done. We have more ammunition, and we are ready to make sure that this doesn't turn into something as bad as it was back in late March. A couple of risks. The obvious one is the healthcare risk. Will we get a second surge of COVID-19 cases over the summer or in the fall when temperatures drop again? The honest answer is I don't know. It won't surprise me to see a second surge. That's typically how these kind of pandemics play out. The good news is we're aware of it now. We know how to identify it. We know how to treat it. And I think a second surge, even in the fall, will not lead to the kind of widespread lockdowns that we've seen that we're currently living through. There are some old risks, though, that are coming back to the forefront. The second one here is probably the one that worries me the most. Simmering tensions between the U.S. and China are rising again, not only on the old front of trade, that's kind of the old news, but now in an effort to assign punishment for the outbreak of COVID-19, at least in the early days, and furthermore, to impose sanctions on China for imposing national security law on Hong Kong well before the agreement expires in the year 2047. I don't mean this to be a political comment. I'll just observe that this White House has identified that picking a fight with China is an appealing thing to do in an election year. It's something where there is political capital. And so I think you will certainly see the rhetoric between the US and China crank up between now and election day in early November. I think the risk that poses is more sentimental than it is fundamental, but at some point there's not much difference between the two, particularly when it comes to trade. And on a similar note, I anticipated at the beginning of this year, I would spend the whole year talking about politics and the different policy proposals put forward by Trump and what appears to be a certain Biden nomination for the Democratic campaign as well. That will come back. There are a lot of differences between those two individuals on policy, particularly as it relates to taxes and as it relates to business regulation, and those will come more to the forefront as the election nears. I think the market has concluded in some ironic way that there is not much difference from a regulatory standpoint between a second Trump administration and a Biden administration in which the GOP still controls the Senate, for the obvious reason that it's very difficult to unwind some of the Trump legislative actions if the Senate is still in GOP hands. If, on the other hand, the GOP loses the Senate and the Democrats control both branches of government, the legislative and the executive, they can get a lot done in 2 years, as Trump did in the first 2 years of his, when he controlled the House of Representatives as well. So we'll watch that as well as we get closer to November and the polls kind of become a little bit more reliable or a little bit more frequent. So let me stop there and take a breath. Again, that's my contact information. I'm happy if questions occur after we part company, don't hesitate to reach out to me or Taryn or Mike and can get a hold of me. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mike and see what kind of questions may have arisen while I've been nattering on for the past 30 minutes.
Well, thank you, Scott. I'd hardly call it nattering. I appreciate very much your clarity and the data that you shared. I think it was very helpful for the audience. I'm sure there's lots of questions, and Steve Young is our air traffic controller for questions. So we'll turn it over to Steve.
Scott, you can reduce your screen. Yep.
Thank you, Scott. Very excellent presentation. Here's one question. Your slide that show impending changes, you know, at work and in the economy, et cetera. One, you said there'll be less reliance on foreign suppliers in the supply chain, but conversely, or going along with that, do you see then a return of manufacturing base, especially from Asia?
I do, and you know, one of the challenges in forecasting the future is that when you don't have any precedents, and we don't for this kind of an economic challenge, it's very difficult to point back and say, just like it happened in 19 whatever, because there is nothing like that. What I am sensing and hearing from particularly our clients at Brown Brothers, about 80% of our clients are families who own private businesses, so they're making these decisions on a daily basis, is that companies are increasingly willing to sacrifice a few points of operating profitability in exchange for resilience or durability or flexibility that comes from supply chains that are closer to home. So if I'm going to come up with a hypothetical. If you made a decision that I could add 1% operating margin point by outsourcing all my manufacturing of whatever to Vietnam or Singapore or China or wherever it is, now I'm willing to pay that price to have that manufacturing come back closer to home. And I think we're going to see that happen. I do not believe this is the end of globalization, as some have termed it, but I do believe this is a step or two back in realization that maybe profitability isn't the only ultimate goal. Maybe resiliency and durability and flexibility ought to be a goal as well. So yeah, Steve, I think we're going to see manufacturing come back on shore. That's not a big binary wave. It's just at the margin, that's going to ebb a little bit. And I think you'll see that. That's good for American. I welcome that, by the way. That's good for American jobs. That's good for the resiliency of the American economy. I think from an economic standpoint, that's a welcome trend.
Well, here's a follow-on. We saw e-commerce surge as the lockdowns began. Do you see those high levels maintained after things open up? Have people gotten used to shopping online and therefore are going to abandon retail altogether?
Again, I think that's one of those fears that's probably overstated in the near term, that well, I'm never going to go to a shopping mall again. Yes, you will. But yeah, you might not go as much. As people figure out, I think everyone's been using Amazon for a long time, and now they're figuring out Amazon can deliver all of this stuff. I may still go back to the mall. I may still want to go, because there's a social aspect to it. But yeah, I think you'll see that e-commerce has taken on a larger and larger share of spending. It was very interesting. The last retail sales data that we got, you could break it down granularly, and you could see a month-over-month decline in auto sales of about 28%. For the obvious reasons that buying a car online is sort of a weird thing. I'm not sure that a lot of people are comfortable with that. I wouldn't be comfortable with that. A 30% drop in the use of restaurants, a 50% drop in clothing and clothing retail stores. On the other hand, e-commerce was up 15 or 20% month over month as those spending patterns changed. So will they continue to run at such high levels? No. But is e-commerce going to go back to the level it was in February before we started relying on it? No, I think those are permanent shifts in the way in which we use e-commerce.
Okay, here's a question. If at the margin, the experience economy, and he says travel, theater, sporting events, receives a smaller share of consumer dollars, which industries do you anticipate to benefit?
Well,
I want to repeat that.
No, I got it. I'm sort of thinking through it because it's a really good question. It's a really broad question, and I think it probably has a twofold answer to it. I think the experience economy is intact. Not right now. It will be intact for the next 6 months, for the next 12 months, maybe until there's a vaccine or there's enough herd immunity. Families may decide to take a vacation by car rather than by plane. But that's not the important thing. The important thing for travel is the business travel. That's where the real margin is. It's me deciding on short notice, I got to take a business trip somewhere and paying full fare to get there. The family booking a vacation 4, 5, or 6 months in advance is not where the real margin is. So I do think that there's a hit to travel. There's a hit to hotels, but it's more of a business hit as business as usual shifts more online. And again, I don't want to overstate that. That's not a big shift. It doesn't mean that we're all going to stop traveling for business. If we all just travel 1 trip less a month, that's a big hit to both travel and entertainment. This is another one of those subtle trends, though, where I do think that there will be more consumption of entertainment at home. So streaming services, your Netflix, Disney Plus, I mean, those things that we've all kind of had to do for entertainment because we can't go out to movies or shows or get on a plane or go on vacation. I think some of those are going to become part of business as usual. They are in the Clemons household. So, and again, so much of this is at the margin, and that's one of those things that at the margin I think is going to be a good change. But we like to travel. We are a herd species. We delight in the company of other people. We delight in novel experiences. And yeah, we're going to get back on planes and we're going to go places at some point. may take a year to get there until we're confident enough to do that, but we'll get back to that.
Karen, do you have any questions from the group overall? Any hands raised from your
I don't
side?
have any hands raised. If somebody would like to raise their hand and ask a question, please go ahead and do that now. There are some comments in the chat area. I'm not sure if this is a good question, but I'm going to throw it out there, and you can tell me it's the wrong question. But do you do you see any trends in specific areas where packaging will really get higher?
Nice use of the word Zoom, by the way. That was unintentional, I'm sure. I'm sure there are dozens of people on this call who could give me that answer better than I could. I mean, I would maybe make the obvious observation that as I sit here in upstate Connecticut, reliant on e-commerce and Amazon and others to bring things to me like paper for my printer. I mean, I don't use a whole lot of printer paper at home, but working at home for the past 2 months, I have. And that came in a box. That landed on the front step in a box from Amazon. So I think that the e-commerce angle to this will likely increase the general demand for boxes. But that's kind of an obvious observation. Beyond that, and into the details, I'm sure there are people on this call who know better than I do.
Okay, we have a hand raised. Bob Cohen.
Yes. Hi, Scott. How are you, Scott?
Hey, Bob.
Question. How do you think the economic situation, the possible recovery, and depending on what type of recovery, will factor in the presidential election in November? What do you think? Is there an edge for anybody in that election cycle?
Good question, Bob. It's nice to see you.
Good to see you, Scott.
You know, I'm gonna say something and then I'm going to immediately contradict myself. So just bear with me. History argues that an incumbent president running for re-election gets reelected on the basis of economic activity. That if it's the old Reagan question. I mean, you remember Reagan's second campaign in 1988. The question basically was, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Because if the answer is yes, let's do it again. And every president since then has asked some variation on that theme. And every incumbent president since then, with the sole exception of his successor, George H.W. Bush, it's worked. H.W. Bush was the last one. So it's clear that this president, President Trump, has to somehow characterize the economic recovery, which will be underway in September, October, November, as a move in the right direction. And he's already done this. He's already characterized himself. This is a wartime economy, with obviously the enemy being the pandemic or being the coronavirus itself. And that he'll position himself as the right manager to have seen the economy through this time and to make America great again, I guess. I don't mean to be flippant in saying that, but that'll be the trend. So that's what history would say, but now I'm going to contradict myself. I think you have to throw history out the window because this president in this presidency has been so ahistorical in just about every way. And there's so many other moving parts at work here. I do believe it comes down to a handful of states. And if you watch a handful of those states that he won in 2016 by very narrow margins, like Michigan, like Pennsylvania, like Florida, look at the employment situation in those states in September and October, and that'll probably tell you what you need to know in terms of his reelection chances.
As a follow-up,
yeah.
So in the states where there's the most restrictive close down, shutdowns of businesses, do you think that'll be impactful? Because those are the same states that he won by slim margins.
Yeah, and of course, Bob, that's where the politics of it gets really interesting because in a lot of those states, you've got Democratic governors, and Michigan being the obvious example, where you've got a Democratic governor who, can be accused politically of dragging her feet in reopening the state in order to make the state suffer the economic pain and vote for Joe Biden. I don't believe there's a single governor in the republic who is intentionally keeping his or her state closed for political reasons. I don't believe that for a second. That's an abhorrent type activity. But the politics of it you have to acknowledge. And then, as long as we're going there, throw in something like the tragedy that's unfolding in Minnesota, of all places, over the past couple of days factors into it as well. So this is one of those years in which I think the polls, maybe even on the state basis, aren't really going to tell the story, because when it comes to election day, it's going to come down to turnout. And of course, in a lot of states, you're going to see a much bigger use of absentee voting and mail-in ballots. So that's why I say I think you have to throw history out the window, because there is so much that is so different about this general election. I'm not sure that the historical patterns are going to give us a whole lot of indication. It's interesting. I watch the polls. I'm a political junkie. I watch the polls and the national polls, the state by state polls. It's interesting to watch the prediction markets as well. So there are betting markets, financial markets for just about anything under the sun. You can find them online, and if you look at the betting markets where people are placing money not on who they want to win the election, but who they think will win the election, two different questions. Donald Trump and Joe Biden are running neck and neck, and they're literally, in a financial sense, at the same price, neck and neck in this. So, Bob, I don't know, and it may become clearer as it goes on. I mean, if we get a second surge, if we have to shut down a lot of the economy again in September and October, that does not bode well for Trump's reelection. At the same time, if we get something closer to a V-shaped recovery, and it turns out that what happened was just a real 2 or 3 month hiatus in economic activity, I think his reelection chances are quite good. Too soon to tell.
Thank you.
Hey, Taryn and gang, we've got a couple of questions. And Scott, we'd certainly like your input on this, but I think this is going to be also some group input.
Yeah.
First is, Scott, among your clients, those client businesses that you talked about, what measures are they using in order to begin opening up to visitors, if you've had those kinds of conversations?
Yeah.
And then broader, I mean, I think that would be a good opportunity for others here on the call to chime in as well.
Yeah, so we see it certainly vicariously in the clients that I spend my days talking to or Zooming with, but of course, we're also doing it ourselves. So Brown Brothers Harriman has 18 offices worldwide, each one of which will have a different path to reopening because obviously circumstances are different. It tends to take a couple of different sort of broad generalizations, one of which is pretty frequent testing. And even if that's not antibody or COVID testing, it's at very least temperature checks each day, each morning, coupled with a restriction in the cohort size in the office. So for example, I might be part of a group and identify and said, all right, these are the 6 people that's really important that you work with. So you're going to come back to the office and you're going to work with these 6 people, but those 6 people are not going to work with anyone else. So we can contain any infection that happens. So if one morning I show up at work and I have a temperature, not only am I sent home to self-isolate, but you can notify the other 5 people in my cohort and that cohort doesn't spread. We're seeing a lot of offices, larger offices, really pay a lot of attention to the way in which traffic moves. So one bank of elevators only goes up, another bank of elevators only goes down, no more than 2 people in an elevator, some simple rules like that. On the floor that Tom Davis and I sit in our New York office, for example, which is sort of a large circular type flow, we'll have a rule that says traffic only goes clockwise. So you don't pass people, you're actually sort of going with the flow. Hand sanitizers, masks, I mean, some of the obvious things come into play there as well. The challenge, of course, in a large urban area like New York is that to even get to the office in the first place, everybody has to usually relies on public transportation. That's a problem. So our offices in smaller markets like Nashville or in Charlotte, where people travel to the office in a private car, they travel alone, they park in a garage, they walk into the office, they've had no interaction with anyone when they set foot in the office. If I get on a subway train in New York City, by the time I set foot in the office, I have walked past 100 people. So, I mean, these are the challenges. And I think a lot of our clients are also going to work from home or remotely as long as they can. so that there is time to either develop a vaccine so that herd immunity can kick in, so that the treatment options become more trustworthy, and it's sort of a combination of all of those things. But what we're finding, and again, with 18 offices worldwide, there's going to be a different time frame and path and pace of reopening in every single one of those 18 offices.
Thank you. We've had another follow-up question on the reliance on foreign suppliers. Will it be the same for all regions of the world, do you feel, or like China versus Europe, or mostly impact Asia?
Well, I think it's worldwide. I think it's a general trend. So it's not. I mean, I've not heard companies within the Brown Brothers Harriman ecosystem, want to, so to speak, punish China. It's not about China. It's about them. It's about their own resilience. So, I mean, think about. I mean, you had the same problem if you had a manufacturing facility in northern Italy. When northern Italy began shutting down in late, I guess mid-February, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter if it's Italy or Hubei or Wuhan. I mean, if it's shut down, it's shut down. So I don't think it's a China-only issue, although to the degree that China's got a very large market share of offshoring over the past generation, it would fall disproportionately on China. But it's not just a China dynamic. I think it's more of a desire to bring those supply chains closer to home.
Taryn, any group questions?
We have a question here from Ben Vale. Ben, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Ben, we're not hearing you if you're talking.
Hold on a sec. Let me see if he's I think he's in. His question, I don't see you, but he's on. Okay, let me see if I can help. He has a question regarding COVID liability waivers for business.
Yeah.
He says he's on the phone but watching on the computer, and I can't see how to get a hold of him, but maybe you can gather some information from that.
Well, so I think so. I mean, I think the question kind of poses itself. I mean, one of the constraints on throwing your doors open back to business as usual is the kind of liability that might incur if a colleague, employee, or a customer comes down with COVID-19 and can trace it back to some interaction on your property. So there are proposals among Congress to layer some kind of liability protection into companies to encourage them to reopen. I think we'll likely see that happen. There's precedence for that. We've seen Congress pass some liability shield before. What I think we'll find is that that'll be a nice thing to have. That may encourage a company to reopen for business maybe a little bit earlier than they otherwise would have. But at the same time, I mean, liability shield or no liability shield, do you still want to put your customers and your employees and your colleagues at risk by reopening too quickly, whether you've got actual financial liability or not? So it's a nice thing to have. It'll be an encouragement to have. It's not a game changer, in my opinion. And the times past when Congress has passed similar things, most recently after 9/11, Congress actually passed liability shields for businesses that operated in Lower Manhattan for those employees who were concerned about the particulate in the air in Lower Manhattan. And of course, Brown Brothers Harriman is in Lower Manhattan. And I don't think it changed any company's minds about how quickly to go back to work after 9/11. Certainly influenced the decision, but it did not dictate the decision.
Thank you, Steve. Did you ask this question? Will the less reliance on foreign suppliers be the same for all regions of the world? For example, China versus Europe.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we.
Okay. Okay, before I turn it over to Mike, I want to ask one favor of the box makers in this group. We've had a couple suppliers on all these calls asking, when are you going to let visitors in? When can people come and visit? Can you go ahead and post in the chat? Just, yes, people can come in now. We're not letting people in for a year. They can come in if they call and set an appointment. Just give them a little bit of information so they have something to work with. I think that's a challenge for the suppliers, and they don't want to infringe, but they just need to know a little bit of information so that they can develop their processes as well. And then I'm turning it over to Mike.
Thank you, Taryn. Thank you again very much, Scott. I think it was a fantastic, the time flew by. So that's always I think the highest tribute that we can share with anyone. So thank you very much for that. I see Tom Davis is on. Thank you, Tom, for making that happen. We appreciate that. Thank you to Lauren Frisch as well. Just a quick comment. One thing that Scott did say about education, AICC and the packaging school has made an overture to more than 400 universities to have access during the summertime to some of the introductory courses that we have at packaging school, both AICC developed courses as well as packaging school developed courses, so that they have some curricula to sustain their students at a time when there's nobody on the campus, but still trying to engage and come up with what's the best way. In the fall, some campuses will be reopening. I know several others are wrestling with the decision and haven't made any decision yet, and others likely will have online education exclusively until the mentality kicks in or until there's a vaccine. And we will endeavor to work with those schools if they want to have packaging education as part of their curriculum. The packaging schools notwithstanding, there's 27 ICPF schools. We're beyond that when we're talking about more than 400. So just wanted to let everyone on the call know that we're trying to do our part there. We appreciate all of you joining us. Again, those of you that are non-members or members that want to just go through a quick review of AICC member benefits, we're going to do a quick little tutorial. It shouldn't take more than 10 minutes, if that, if I'm lucky and in good voice. So we'll give everybody that's interested a chance to stay on. Everybody who's interested a chance to head for the hills as quickly as possible. And we wish you all a great weekend. And again, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Taryn. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you all. Have a good weekend.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Scott.
Thanks, guys.
And what I'm going to do then is, as promised, we will, AICC is known as a membership and meeting organization. We'll see if I can get the share screen to work. And what do we do at a time when we are not able to meet the way we would like to? So I just want to go through a couple of slides to show everyone what AICC is offering these days. The COVID resources are, I think, the first one and the most acute and most obvious. The bi-weekly video conferences, which you are now on. Thank you very much. Just a reminder that we're providing daily updates at our website. There is a page that you can go to. It's aiccbox.org/COVID. Every day we put in a lot of links, a lot of interesting items, some of it today we put up the new CDC guidelines for offices that are reopening or for people who are reintroducing staff to their offices had they been working remotely. So we get timely information. We take a lot of those documentations and we put them on a back page, a summary of key documents and regulations, so that you don't have to go scrolling through the history of this daily update going back to, I believe it was March 19th or thereabouts when we first put the first one up. We'll stay on top of the COVID changes as long as they are valid. I was on a call today with all of the paper-related packaging associations. AF&PA, the American Forest and Paper Association, hosts it. The topic of discussion was rumblings from state chapters, if you will, particularly from the NANAM, that states will come out with their own version of OSHA-type requirements. There was somebody speaking, we're in the state of Virginia here, that within a week, Virginia OSHA will have their own guidelines for how employers can make workspaces safe. It's kind of interesting that they're doing it now, since so many of you have been working for 3 months as essential businesses, but it's something that regulatorily speaking could be coming up soon. We'll stay on top of these things as we're trying to stay on top of everything else. Education and training has been a major member benefit pre-pandemic, but I can tell you that the utilization of AICC's education and training has gone through the roof since the pandemic. And one of the reasons for that is the training time is eligible for employees under PPP programs. So even if they're not out operating a machine or in your customer service department engage with customers. If they are training, those hours count towards your PPP coverage with the Small Business Administration. So we've got, in this current month, we've had about 1,700 learners on the platform. Since the beginning of 2017, we've about 4,500 courses completed. There's almost 2,000 courses currently in process on the platform. So that just shows you how the utilization has jumped. We have a lot of courses available in Spanish. You got to go online, more than 80 overall in English. You'll see the Spanish ones there also. This is a benefit for every employee of every AICC member company. And about 430 AICC member companies out of about 460, 470 are taking advantage of this at this time and have been for some time for a lot of them. So education and training, we've had a slogan for a while: no travel doesn't mean no training. So we've got lots of courses there for you. We're still working on new ones. We're also working on translations as we can. We have to thank our education investors. They've made several courses available. Just want to give them a shout out right now: Fosber, BCM, Sun Automation, JB Machinery, Pomarco, Absolute, and Printron. Stafford Corrugated Products, EFI, Kruger, Bops, and HP have been partners with AICC on developing education curricula, and a few of those have also participated in translation of their courses to Spanish, so we thank them very much. Leadership groups have been very active during the pandemic. It's a great benefit of membership to participate in a CEO group or the Emerging Leader Program or leadership advisory groups as they're being developed, but several of these groups are meeting on a weekly basis, on a bi-weekly basis, by telephone, of course, or by video conference, talking about what's going on. The CEO groups, this is, as you might imagine, it's a group of CEOs, no more than 10, a geographically diverse group so that there's no competitive issues between them. But we think that we're helping a lot with the big picture view, with the video conference, with the website. These smaller groups, people in the same businesses, people dealing with the same issues, people coming up with best practices on their own or with things they're getting elsewhere and sharing them. It's a tremendous strength. The emerging leaders have been active in discussing a lot of things during this program. That's, or during the pandemic, that's for the under 35 crowd. We've been developing leadership advisory groups, a production leadership group, and we plan some groups in the future. The pandemic slowed us down a little bit as we developed those things, but these are benefits that you can take advantage of with an AICC membership. And the great thing about AICC members, both general, that is the box makers, as well as the associate members, is they are so open and willing to share not just their time, but their information and their best practices. And it's really come through during this pandemic where everybody was dealt a completely new deck of cards with which to play, and they've all helped each other out in a tremendous way. And it's made us as an AICC staff quite proud to be working with all of you. Supercore Expo was postponed until August of 2021. During the original show dates, which were September 14th through 18th of this year, AICC and TAPI are going to put on a virtual What's New so that exhibitors will be able to share the latest innovations with you, kind of like we're sharing right now. You'll be able to sit at your desk and be able to see what's on. It's not going to be a slog. It's going to be quick. They're going to be informative, and it'll help you make your game plan for joining us when Supercore Expo does stage in August of 2021. So watch your emails for information about that as we get closer to September. There's the ongoing supply of stats and resources through AICC's monthly scoring boxes, goes through what's going on in the box and paper industries. We have publications and white papers that we don't stop working on, and we have Box Score. An issue just came out. There'll be another issue coming out in 2 months. That's bi-monthly. And we pivoted a lot. The latest Box Score has a lot of COVID-related information in it, so it's timely and helpful, and hopefully you're going to take advantage of it. We've got our technical advisors. You're not in this alone. So we've got Tom Weber for folding carton. We've got Doug Friel for safety. He's the gentleman in the middle. And the ever famous Ralph Young for corrugated. These are folks that you can access via email or call up and ask them questions, and they can help you out. This is a member service. AICC provides this service for you, and these resources are available to you, and they can get answers quickly. And if they don't know the answer, they go out to their network and they get you the answer. And it usually occurs pretty quick. And they're usually very, very good answers that they share. So we urge you to take advantage of AICC's technical advisors. Kind of lost in all of this because of you saw the unemployment statistics. If you are looking for people, there's obviously a lot of people looking for work, but AICC also has a relationship with an organization called JobPath, which is an organization run by military veterans that takes veterans that are looking for work and puts them with employers that are looking to fill jobs. And AICC members can put a job posting up or can search for a prospective worker free of charge for a basic service at the JobPath website. And there are links from the AICC website to do that. And if you want to get more sophisticated in your searching or in the posting of your jobs, by all means, you could spend a couple of dollars in addition to the free service and enhance your listing. The cool thing about JobPath is it's got a military translator in the sense that it takes a veteran's mode of operation background, translates that into civilian speak, takes your job need, translates that into military speak, so everybody understands what they're getting themselves involved with. So if you haven't made yourself familiar with JobPath and you're looking for people, by all means, check that out. That's my quick and dirty presentation on AICC member benefits. If anyone has any questions, either I or the AICC staff will be happy to answer them. So Taryn, anybody, or Steve, anybody asking any questions?
Not seeing any. I did want to add that we are, AICC is getting ready to launch a virtual conference, which will all be education related, focused around machinery, digital printing, e-commerce, flexo, litho. Am I missing anything? That'll be sometime.
Well, we haven't finished it yet, so we're going to add some more stuff. So
that'll be sometime in the fall, but we're looking for speakers, and this is a great opportunity for suppliers, since I see a lot of you on here. Great opportunity for suppliers to submit your ideas for topics that would be of value to our members. And I'll be sending more information out to all of you in the future.
Okay, I guess that's it then. We appreciate you hanging in a little long. If any questions do come up, you know how to find us. And we'll wish you a great weekend. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll develop a program, and we'll see you in 2 weeks on this video conference. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Darren.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.